Guten Tag, mein Name ist Bernie Lewin. I'm the author of Searching for the Catastrophe Signal on the origin of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an account of how the climate emergency began. I'm pleased to see the German translation of my book published by R. Rahman Verlag. But I'm disappointed to see the climate emergency continuing on and on with only flimsy scientific evidence. The emergency continues at COP26 in Glasgow this year, 2021. My book tells the story of events that climaxed around the time of the very first COP. That is the very first meeting of parties to the Climate Convention. That meeting was hosted by a young Angela Merkel in Berlin in 1995. You might wonder why I got interested in this story. I have been involved in the environment movement in my native Australia since I was a teenager in the 1970s. Although I was only casually skeptical of the climate emergency. But when this scare about the warming catastrophe started to overwhelm all other environment issues, I got curious about how it came to be that those who doubted the scientific basis of the climate scare, those who wanted to discuss the science, were vilified as anti-science. And that was when I started my research. My research led me to the early days of the scare, how it all began, and I was fortunate enough to interview many of the leading climate scientists from the 70s and 80s, some of whom are no longer with us. They were very forthcoming with insights and meeting documents that would be almost impossible to obtain otherwise. The stories these documents told shocked me, most especially in how they showed that most of the leading climate researchers in the 1980s, at the time the scare began, were strongly skeptical, and they were resistant to the movement to inflame public fear. As the old guard retired, they were replaced by a new guard, among whom there were a very few who were prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to produce the sufficient evidence required to support the scare. And then, as the climate emergency took off and funding poured into research as never before, critics within and outside the small climate science community were most effectively silenced. What I also found was that this was not just a story of the corruption of climate science, but also a story of the transformation of science and of science for policy, the interaction between science and society in the United States in the post-war period. Indeed, this is a story essentially about the United States, about science funding there, and about science and policy in the post-war period. Today, the relationship of science to policy and public trust in science in the United States and elsewhere is something in urgent need of understanding. And I believe that the remarkable story of how the climate emergency began will help us to understand other science policy issues emerging now and in the future. So I hope you enjoy this story of how the whole climate emergency began. The story climaxes with the incredible tale of how a young scientist won the big prize by finding the catastrophe signal up there in the sky, a signal that wasn't really there, and how this finding was supported and not disputed by all and sundry, and how this support was sufficient to set the ball rolling, the ball that now rolls on for the 26th revolution in Glasgow 2021.